My story begin. My story begins in the early 20th century on the Spirit Lake Dakota Indian Reservation in North Dakota. And I've recently extended my land ownership analysis to Fort Berthold in the western part of the state in my efforts to try to understand homesteading on Indian reservations. You will have to tell me what part of the story applies to your family experience, as Rolette is closer to the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Reservation than it is to Spirit Lake. And it is a tiny reservation by comparison, and it is the center of life of a different tribe and culture. But I'd like to begin with the proposition that although my story is of a very particular place at a particular time, the overarching narrative of immigration as it contributes to the dispossession of Native peoples is deeply American. So my aim is to present some of the quandaries that stem from our history and hope that they spark a conversation. When I was a child, my Norwegian grandmother had told me an unlikely story about growing up on an Indian reservation. And my cousins will probably recognize Helena Hogan Canton, who is the little girl standing behind the matriarch, Bertha Hogan. I knew from my study of history that women had homesteaded land in the West. But Scandinavians on an Indian reservation, that seemed really hard to fathom. But the story stayed with me. At one point when I did an oral history with my grandmother, she explicitly said, "We stole the land from the Indians." So when I drove out to the Spirit Lake Reservation for the first time, I was struck by the beauty of the prairies and the astonishing bird life. But nothing was familiar, and I knew no one. A gravel road that headed south to the Cheyenne River marked the border of my great-grandmother's homestead, and I could see her shack perched atop a gentle hill. After talking to local history keepers, I discovered that my grandmother had not been the only Norwegian living there, nor was she the only woman landowner. Many Dakota women owned land as well. And that curious juxtaposition of Scandinavian homesteaders with Dakota Indians intrigued me and launched me on a 15-year journey to explore how it happened and with what consequences. And my discoveries have not stopped with the publication of my book, and I'll speak more to that later. In an oral history recorded for the State Historical Society of North Dakota, Norwegian American Garina Moe told of her husband's rare and valuable talent. He was a water dowser. Quote, "He would go out with the willow, and wherever there was water, the willow turned down to the ground." Now, as you all know, many on the prairie were called upon to find and tap that scarce and essential resource. Water was harder to find in some places, and farmers would dig as many as 20 wells before they found it. In other places, such as the Moe's farm, they were lucky enough to find water with the first dig and have the well last for 50 years. One of the many delightful people I met in North Dakota was a different kind of dowser. Norwegian American Yule Smestad was a bone dowser. Instead of locating water with a willow branch, he had the gift of finding bones. In locating people's skeletal remains, he linked the living to the dead by allowing them to know precisely where their ancestors lay. In the process of identifying these unmarked graves, Smestad unearthed the consequences of judgment, superstition, and prejudice. Some wayward souls were buried outside consecrated ground because the church fathers found their lives unworthy of holy sanction or of forgiveness. Others were excluded because they were the wrong religion or the wrong nationality. Yul Smestad once located the remains of an African-American family buried in the periphery of a church cemetery. He told me, "Sure enough, I found one outside the fence. See, they wouldn't let them in." Like Yul Smestad, I feel the calling of a dowser, a story dowser. I search for the forgotten or vexing stories of the past, bringing some unrecognized members into the family plot and marking their graves. But I do not always put people at ease by knowing that their ancestors are rightfully placed. Unlike Yul Smestad, my unearthing is often unsettling. I aim to press people to think deeply about these stories, many unhappy, some tragic, others victorious. On the reservation, Dakota's visits to settlers' homes often had an element of surprise. Not only were they unscheduled, but Indians did not knock. Early white settlers told many stories of being startled by the unannounced presence of an Indian in their home. They would hear nothing, feel their skin prickle, and then notice someone standing behind them or in the next room. In an oral history, Grace Lambert, a Dakota elder, explained the cultural practices behind many a misunderstanding. She said Dakotas had never lived in houses, so they had no custom of knocking on doors. She said, "I remember when we were kids, when we would go anywhere, we never knocked on doors. We just opened the door and walk in because a teepee had no door. So you wouldn't be standing there knocking on a teepee." And then she laughed. "They just opened the flap and walked in. So we did the same. We opened the door and walked in." And when I think of it now, I think, "Oh my, we were rude." And then she burst out laughing. Grace Lambert made an effort to understand the logic of white people who lived on the reservation, just as she strove to learn, interpret, and convey her own people's history and practices. Accustomed to teepees, Dakotas did not knock. With wooden dwellings, Scandinavians did. They understood their homes as private property and places of familial sanctuary. Dakotas considered their teepees to be open to family and guests, a place to rest and a place to host. Honorary, that's another picture of Grace Lambert and her family. Honorary tribal historian of Spirit Lake Dakotas, Louis Garcia, recalls a knocking story. He said that Solomon Red Fox was a great joker. Solomon Red Fox is the gentleman standing to the left in the overalls and white shirt. As Louis tells it, he'd come into the white farmer's house, come in the door, shut the door behind him, and then he'd knock on the door. In story after story, encounters between Dakota Indians and Scandinavian settlers begin with apprehension, involve an exchange, and end with gestures of friendliness that dissipate hostility and misunderstanding. Another account relayed to me by Louis Garcia explains the backstory to this photograph of Solomon Red Fox and his family. The US government had turned to religious institutions starting in the 1870s to administer Indian policy through educating and Christianizing Native people. And at Spirit Lake, that translated into missions by Episcopalians and Catholics, not Lutherans. At Spirit, so language was obviously important and a key role in helping people find a place of worship. Lutheran services on the reservation were delivered either in Norwegian or Swedish, and sometimes they would just rotate week by week. But early Presbyterian ministries had translated the Bible into Dakota, and they sought Dakota people to be ministers of the faith. And so many Dakotas were Presbyterian. That was true of Solomon Red Fox. At times, religious affiliation seemed less important than the practice of Christianity. In the summer of 1929, when in transit between Fort Totten and Lake Traverse Sisseton Reservation, the Red Fox family was visiting kin and picking berries. And they camped here at the dump grounds near Binford, North Dakota, where they would sometimes rummage for salvageable items. And after setting up camp, Mrs. Louise Red Fox Two Bear gave birth. She's sitting on the ground in the front holding a baby. As Christians, the family valued the spiritual importance of baptizing the baby, so they decided to seek assistance. There was also a very high incidence of infant mortality, which shaped how they thought about baptism. So the morning after the baby, I'm hearing somebody. Anyway, so the morning after the baby was born, a couple of them went into town and they conscripted Reverend Matthias Ordahl, standing there in front of the lean-to, to come out. He was a Lutheran minister, and he baptized the baby. He brought his daughter with him, who was sitting there on the ground in the front. And although the Red Fox family was not Lutheran, they warmly received Reverend Ordahl and his daughter. So in this encounter, expectations were interrupted and undermined, but they prompted each other to accept and understand motivations and intention. And what I would say here is that dislocated people moved from being cultural insiders in their homeland to being outsiders in a strange place. So this applies to both the Norwegians and the Dakotas. They were dislocated people who were understood not necessarily to have a history. Now, to the reigning, better established English-speaking Yankees, Scandinavian newcomers did not have a history, except insofar as they were land-hungry peasants. Describing the influx of immigrants as an overwhelming act of nature, Cherry Lane Wood, who gave another one of those oral histories to the State Historical Society, and who was a Yankee born in Dakota Territory, commented, "There's an awful lot of Scandinavians in through here, that when we was first here, when I was little, there wasn't any. They came in just like a flood."
All the way up on my.
From the perspective of Dakotas, Scandinavians were yet another group of white people trying to seize.
Karen, let me interrupt briefly. Some of you, I think, are not muted. If you aren't muted, would you do so, please? We are getting a little interference. Thank you. Okay.
Okay. In turn, Yankees and Scandinavians did not recognize that Native people had a long record of adaptation, innovation, and change. Rather, they cast Dakotas as fierce warriors, men, not women, who were remnants of the past, not people who belonged to modern society. The white groups paid little attention to women, even though they were the farmers in Dakota culture and respected by Dakota men for the many contributions that they made. Power enables one group to assert the invisibility of the subordinate group, erase its history, and disrespect its distinctiveness. Now, underlying cultural misunderstandings was the conflict over land. On the Spirit Lake Dakota Indian Reservation, we find the human face of expropriation, the land takers and the dispossessed. The encounter was imbued with a mutual fearfulness born of violent conflict. The U.S.-Dakota War of 1862 occurred in Minnesota, but it directly affected many of those who came to live in North Dakota. Sissotans and Wahpetons at Spirit Lake had lived in southern Minnesota prior to the war, as had some of the Scandinavians who then relocated to the region. Although Dakotas lost the War of 1862, they killed a large number of white settlers and government soldiers. Reeling from the loss of their historic way of life in the wake of war, but still recognized as a sovereign nation, Sisseton, Wahpeton, and Ihunktongwana bands of Dakota collectively negotiated a treaty with the US in 1867 that established Spirit Lake, which was 240,000 acres. Dispossession for them meant relocation and population decline. All across the Great Plains, whites were frightened by the military prowess of Indians. With attitudes shaped by newspaper accounts, family stories, novels, and their own imagination, Scandinavians entered the region with an encounter anxiety and expectations of conflict. Second-generation Swede Gust Berg bought land on the reservation in 1922 after he married Annie Bostrom, who had just arrived from Sweden. Gust's father and older brother had homesteaded. Gust recalled in one of those North Dakota oral history interviews, "I was just scared to death of them Indians because they said they'd scalp people. See, they made me believe that, and I was scared to death. Then the Indians came over here one day by the name of Fox." So visiting with Solomon Red Fox dissipated Gust Berg's fear. In turn, white settlers, including Scandinavians, inspired dread as well as unease in Indians. Dakotas had good reason to fear the US Army. It had a reputation for fighting unfairly, massacring children and women, and vengefully destroying homes and stockpiles of food. And the settlers came for land, their land. The government structured the conditions of land taking through two pieces of legislation in particular: the Dawes Act of 1887 and at Spirit Lake, the Land Allotment Act of 1904. So in a nutshell, after allotment of private property to individual Indians, the Spirit Lake Reservation was opened to white homesteading. This broadside, which was published in 1904, marked in red those parcels on the reservation, unallotted land, that were open to homesteading. So in effect, the legislation created the conditions of coexistence as well as the seeds of further dispossession. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the reservation, the southern border is very squiggly, as you can see, and it is the Cheyenne River. And the northern border is Devil's Lake, which, as you also know from reading newspapers, has contracted at various moments in time and also flooded and become much larger.
Karen, can you put with your finger, show us where approximately the lake is today?
You know what? I don't know that. It's a really good question. I don't know how high it is, but I know a lot of people lost farmland as it started flooding in the last decade.
Thank you.
Yeah. And it is here that Scandinavians became settler colonists. So they arrived as part of migration streams and they searched for a place to remake home. They came to anchor themselves on the land, making farms and making families. And while they did not venture forth as mercenaries or as conscious participants in a colonial scheme, they nonetheless advanced the US imperial project of seizing and transforming North America. So that had its consequences. This is a close-up of a plat map in Eddy Township, which traverses the southern border. You see the Cheyenne River kind of going through the middle of it. So the northern part is the reservation, the southern part is not. And I discovered these plat maps, which you may be familiar with, early in my quest to try to understand what was going on in the reservation, and I just absolutely fell in love with them because they illustrate so graphically who owns the land, and how ethnically mixed these communities, what became communities were. So I've marked in blue the Scandinavian landowners, most of whom are Norwegian, but not all of whom. And I'll just point that this blue block right here belonged to my great-grandmother, Bertha Hogan. Her name was not yet on it because she hadn't proved up her homestead by 1910, which is when this map was made. But integration of white settlers and Native Americans was part of the intent of the legislation. And I think what's important that I want to point out here is that the groups lived side by side, and you all know what those North Dakota winters are like, and how hard it is to scratch a living out of 160 acres of land. So they knew each other up close and had frequent contact, and they had to learn to coexist together. But like with knocking, Dakotas and Scandinavians brought different cultural conceptions to owning land. And I think that's also really important. Judge William Gipp, a member of the Standing Rock Tribal Council and a tribal court judge, explained in one of the North Dakota oral history interviews. Our Indian way of life is just the opposite of the white. See, the white man is out to accumulate just as much as he can, and the more he can accumulate, the higher his status becomes. The Indian was the other way around. The more he could give was a status. Johnson Williams, a Sisseton Wahpeton living in South Dakota, articulated a common Dakota critique of white culture. A white guy, it just seems like he lives mostly for the money, and he'll go to any length to get money. And then he laughs. And that's what we can't understand among Indians. It's just not like that. What you have is meant to be shared. Accumulation of money or land implied greedy selfishness, which Indians found difficult to comprehend. But accumulation of land was a dream for Norwegians. It was a cultural commitment, an intergenerational pledge. Keep the land, pass it on to your children and to their children. This is a map that I generated from my land ownership analysis. This is from 1910. And the dots are the Scandinavian landowners and the grids are the Dakota landowners. And you can see it kind of approximates in a rough way that, that broadside advertising homestead land. So when Scandinavians moved onto the reservation starting in 1904, Dakotas were demographically dominant. But by 1910, non-Indians outnumbered enrolled tribal members. And by 1910, a large group of Scandinavians were landowners on the reservation, and they were second only to Dakotas. And again, for any of you who are familiar with the reservation, you'll know this, but the northern part of the reservation, which borders the lake, is very hilly and has shrubs and trees, and the southern part of the reservation is flatter and has a lot more tillable land. So the Scandinavians were moving in to farm, and so that southern land was land that they found really appealing. Not all of it was great farmland, but some of it was. So then again, in my analysis of land ownership between 1910 and 1929, what we see is a big shift in who owns the land on the reservation. So Dakota's land loss accelerated. Here they are in 1910 and here they are in 1929, about half as much land as they had just 20 years before. And Scandinavians, on the other hand, increased their land ownings through homesteading and land purchase, and to a lesser extent, inheritance. But you can see that the successful Scandinavian landowners owned more acreage than the Dakotas by 1929.
Any evidence, Karen, what today's map would look like? What these?
I don't know. And it's a really great question. What's true today, or, you know, and has happened over the last several decades, is that the tribe itself, which has more money because of the casino and other things, and so they have a land buyback program. So the tribe itself owns some land, as well as Dakota people who have also held on to their land. But I don't know. It would take a couple of years for me to figure that out, which is why I stopped in 1930. So, but it's a really important question, I think. It's a really important question. And one of the things that's important to put this in perspective is these are small hardscrabble farmers. So successful Scandinavian landowners were still among the poorest in the entire state. So in 1930, their average farm size was 1/3 that of North Dakota as a whole, the North Dakota average. So we're talking about small, we're talking about poor people. So that's what success looked like. But Dakotas and Scandinavians were not adversaries in a formal sense, nor were they allies, but they were both profoundly poor and they were both displaced in various ways. And over time, they figured out how to be neighbors in this enclave. Now, importantly, the strong arm of the federal government intervened in and monitored and undermined Dakota's lives while it permitted Scandinavians to navigate their own adaptations, as long as, and this is not small, they sent their children to school, they paid their taxes, and they learned to speak English. And I'm sure Barbara Hendy Marcello could speak to that even more. It wasn't necessarily a smooth process. But I think it's interesting in this context, and maybe a bit of a surprise to, again, even in the context of the dispossession, to recognize that Scandinavians faced many of the same challenges as Dakotas. They were farming in a harsh environment. They were very poor and had little capital. Both groups preferred to speak their native language. Norwegian continues to be spoken into the third and even some of fourth generation families. Both groups value and maintain kinship ties, and they're both defiant against dominant Yankee culture in some ways. Yet, homesteaders gained their foothold as landowners and as citizens through Dakota's dispossession. And that process placed the two in antagonistic positions sometimes, even as they were trying to make a livelihood. So legal distinctions that racialized and subordinated Native people kept them separate. But at the same time, ironically, the reservation held them in close proximity with Scandinavians. So they were poor, marginalized, non-English speaking people living side by side. So I want to introduce you to Bjorn Knudsen. The immigrant Norwegian Knudsen family had multiple tenant-landlord relationships over the years. One of their children, Bjorn Knudsen, who I was able to interview, described himself as full-blooded Norwegian. He was born on the reservation and lived there all his life. When he was 12, his father sent him by himself to plow a field that they were renting from a Dakota woman, Mary Blackshield. Now, Mary Blackshield was one of a handful of Indian women who made efforts to expand their land holdings. So when land was put on the open market, she would make bids to try to purchase more. And she resourcefully used her land to generate an income to support herself and her elderly mother who lived with her. Now, because the Blackshield land was far from their home, Bjorn had to spend the week at the home of Mrs. Blackshield, whom he had never met before. So he tells me the story. Dad rigged up a set of full line of equipment, horses and plow and a wagon and everything, and he told me just exactly where to go. But when I got north of Fort Totten, there were no roads hardly, just trails, and I kind of got lost. So I stopped along the side of the road where an old man was plowing with his horses. His name was LaRose. He was a French Indian, very nice fellow. He told me where to go. So I took off with my horses. When I pulled into the yard at Mrs. Blackshield's, there was an elderly Indian lady outside plastering her chicken coop with mud. She had mud from her face clear down to her toes. And then he laughs. But it was a kind of a yellow clay, and that was what the Indian people used if they could find that kind of soil to plaster their buildings with, their log buildings. She knew I was coming. She says, "Put your horses in the barn," she said. "I know you're supposed to stay here, and I know your dad real well." And she said, "There's feed in the bin." She says, "There's hay in the upstairs. Take care of your horses," she says, "and come on in and supper will be ready." Well, I wasn't too enthused. At that particular time, I wasn't really hungry. And then Bjorn laughs because it just made me wonder what kind of household this would be where I had to stay. But when I stepped into that home, I got the biggest surprise of my life. That lady was all washed up. She had a nice clean dress on. Everything was spick and span. There was a tablecloth on the table. She lived in a 2-room house, but it had an upstairs, and it had a plain floor, not pine, but a fir floor. That floor had been scrubbed, so it was almost white. And it was one of the best, as good a meal as I've ever eaten. I stayed there about a week. Now, Mrs. Blackshield had been spotting her chicken coop. It was common to prepare log buildings for the winter by filling gaps between the logs with clay. And young Bjorn knew that women working on a farm got dirty. His own mother was a prime example. But he did not know Mrs. Blackshield, and he was put off by her initial appearance. In retrospect, he was amused by his fear of the unknown. Now, Mrs. Blackshield was a well-educated lady, and then he laughs again. She had taken many prizes in cooking and baking and exhibiting products like that in the fairs. Of course, I didn't know this. I thought she was like some other Indian neighbor that we had, just common people. But she was a well-educated Indian lady. And he reckoned that he gathered the nerve to enter the house, quote, "because I knew that Dad would never send me to a place that wasn't fit to live in." Now, while Mrs. Blackshield did her best to make Bjorn feel at home that week, he continued to be intimidated by her mother, who lived with her. So education diminished the distance between Dakotas and Scandinavians, but there remained a huge gulf of understanding when facial expressions and customs could not be interpreted or could be easily misinterpreted. I have to say this about her mother. Her mother did not like me. She could not speak English, but she would sit there and stare at me. So I was almost afraid of her, because I could understand why the Indian people didn't care much about the white people in those days. I imagine that was the reason for it. Now, the young Bjorn, who did not speak Dakota, and Mrs. Blackshield's mother, who did not speak English or Norwegian, experienced a cultural standoff. From Bjorn's perspective, an elderly lady sitting quietly in the corner would make no gesture of friendship, only if she were angry. His cultural estrangement was mediated through a lens tinged by guilt. He inferred her motives for not liking him. They still say it today, and that the white man came into this country and took their land away from them, and they weren't properly reimbursed for it. So Bjorn Knudsen knew that Dakotas got a raw deal, yet his family lived right there on the reservation. His father was employed by the Fort Totten boarding school, teaching carpentry to Indian children. His mother ran the farm that they homesteaded. In effect, their livelihoods were dependent upon the dispossession of Dakotas and the government efforts to assimilate them through schooling. Bjorn was aware of all of that. So he interpreted the ancient mother's steady gaze as disapproval and dislike. That lady was at least 100 years old. She'd sit in that chair and she'd mumble to herself all the time. Now, whether she was talking Indian, I don't know. She was a really old lady. She just sat in that one particular place. But I could tell by looking at her that she didn't like me. No. So we have to ask, what might the situation have looked like from the perspective of Mrs. Blackshield's mother? In her culture, young people were expected to defer to elders. She may or may not have liked him personally. Certainly, she knew the horrors white people had perpetrated on Indians, although we do not know her specific story. The intimate encounter would have compelled her to exercise careful discernment about this young Norwegian boy entering her daughter's house and plowing her land. So I'm wondering if I should go ahead and tell my next story, Paul, or if I should stop and take questions, because the next story is about a wedge driven between Dakotas and a Norwegian family. So
Karen, my hope would be that you would continue, and we'll just take our chances here at the end. We're going to have open discussion after you finish your formal thing. So I think you have some stuff to share. This is our opportunity to hear it. So go to it.
Okay, I'll do that, and then I'll make myself available after the hour too. That's fine with me. So living close together also drove a wedge between Dakotas and Scandinavians. Second generation Norwegian American Einar Sivertsen recalled a story about a visit by an Indian family to his childhood homestead in Nelson County on the Totten Trail, not far from Spirit Lake, but not on the reservation. So that's important to know. Native people frequently traveled across their property, or another way of thinking about it is their property fell across the long-used Totten Trail. Einar, whose portrait was taken by the State Historical Society when he did an oral history with them in 1976, recalled a moment from his childhood that powerfully delineated a racial ethnic boundary observed by his father. I remember one time there was an Indian family come in a covered wagon, and they stopped at our place, and they had a baby born. And he died. He died on the homestead there when they stopped overnight. So they asked my dad if they could bury him somewhere, anywhere out there on this land. Well, no, Dad said. We'd rather you go off my property and bury right on the road that comes in there, where Route 32 comes into town there. So they buried him right by the road. I think we're driving right over the grave. I imagine it went up in bones when they built the road a second time. Now, it's painful to imagine how the Indian parents must have felt. They lost their baby while in transit, and the request to bury him where he died was denied. Einar's father's proprietary sense about his property converged with his aversion to Indians and his possible concern about their repeated returns to pay tribute to their departed child. Would he have done the same to another Norwegian family passing through? Without embalming, a dead body would quickly decay. So for health reasons and presumably emotional ones as well, immediate interment was required. So the family had to bury their infant near the road. In England, burial by the roadside was an ignominy reserved for criminals and heretics. The fictional community in Nebraska depicted in Willa Cather's My Antonia refused to allow the corpse of Mr. Schmerda, a bohemian who took his own life, to be buried in the Norwegian cemetery. The newborn Indian baby and a suicidal man could find a resting place only by the side of the road. So at the time of the interview in 1976, Einar was 84 years old. Clearly, his father's action, emblazoned in his memory, had plagued him ever since. In retrospect, Einar Sivertsen struggled with the cruelty of his father's act. So as I was finishing my book and about to go to press, I sent a copy of the book to Louis Garcia, who I mentioned earlier, the honorary tribal historian of Dakotas, because I regularly consulted with him about spelling of Dakota names and the ancestral logic of many Dakota practices. So he read this passage and told me that he had actually heard that same story from someone else. And about 20 years before, the former tribal chairman of Spirit Lake Dakotas, whose name was Elmer White, had told Garcia that members of the tribe had been searching the region for sites relevant to Dakota history. In the process, Elmer White stopped by the Sivertsen farm where the family told him the story. And then he told Garcia that to this day, the grave is guarded. When road improvements have been made, they oversee the process to make sure the grave is not disturbed. Now, when I heard this story from Garcia, in light of what I knew about the racial ethnic tensions in the region, I assumed it was the Dakota family whose baby died that tended the farm, that tended the grave. So I wrote this poignant moment into the book. But then once the book was out in print, I sent a copy to Louis straight away, and he said, "Oh no, Karen, you got it completely wrong. It was not the Dakota family that guarded the grave, but the Sivertsen family. The Norwegian landowners continued to tend the infant's grave." Elmer White, who was a direct descendant of Chief Wanatan, one of the last hereditary chiefs of the tribe, had explained to Garcia that, quote, "when they widened the road, Grandpa stood on the grave and made the machinery go round him as he didn't want the grave disturbed. It was his mission in life." Clearly troubled by his father's behavior, Einar Sivertsen told an interviewer from the State Historical Society this very story. Why didn't he not say that his family attempted to make amends by tending the grave? Did he say this as a way of accepting culpability that he saw as rightfully placed on his family's shoulders? And if it wasn't Einar who guarded the grave, who was it? Who acted to make amends? It's just not clear. And unfortunately, Elmer White died some years ago, as did Einar Sivertsen. So while I was troubled by this error of interpretation, which I had made in print, it also made me newly optimistic about the possibilities of the different meaning of this story. So what it said to me is that there was no longer an intractable divide between Norwegians and Dakotas. In the corrected version, a family recognized its profound misjudgment and sought to make amends for their actions. And they treated the baby's grave with honor. And in the process, they hoped, I think, to redeem themselves. So the story goes on. Once the book was published, I gave a lecture about the book at Little Hoop Community College, Kendeshka Shikana Community College. I'm sure I didn't pronounce that. That's on the reservation. And I told the audience about my exchange with Luis Garcia, and he was there in the audience. And I told them about the discovery that I made after the publication of the book. And I invited people in the audience to contact me if they had any family stories that related to this. So there just aren't other kinds of sources to try to verify one thing or the other. And when I said that, a Dakota man in the audience raised his hand and said he did not need me to do any more research. The basic fact that a Norwegian family was tending the grave was enough to give him pause, and in his mind, grounds to rethink his view about the historical relationship between the two groups. So, to summarize in a nutshell, this 25-year period of coexistence that I studied transformed the relationship between Scandinavians and Dakotas. They became wary neighbors, and sometimes they became kin. Human relationships were laden with baggage, carrying guilt and resentment, which is still evident today, but they also managed to live together without violence. The reservation context required a kind of tolerance, even as their clash of logics of the way to live clashed with everyone. And everyone had to reckon not just with the historic, but with the continued dispossession of Dakota land. So in undertaking this project, I sought to know more about my grandmother's life, and I tried to understand how Scandinavians reconciled their vision of themselves as fair and ethical people with their role in the land taking. And I've discovered how deeply complicated the story is. So I think many of these stories point to ways that there can be a dialogue and that there is reconciliation. And I think it's a powerful example of how the past can illuminate relationships of today. So I just want to close by showing you a site that, again, if some of you have been on the reservation, you will have seen. But one of the ways the Norwegians influenced life on the reservation was to build a ski jump on the top of the highest hill on the reservation in an otherwise flat landscape. Yeah. So thank you all for listening and for joining me in trying to make sense of this history.
Great.
I would like everybody who is muted, you can unmute yourself and you can ask questions. And Aaron, why don't you start off with a question?
I have a question.
Go ahead, Chell. Chell from Norway. Yes,
hello. How come the settlers settle in Indian reservation? I thought the Indian reservation wasn't a federal land. So how could they legally settle there?
That is such an important question. And the federal government, when they decided that Indians should own land as individuals privately, they divided up most reservations, not all, and gave people, Indian people, allotments if they were enrolled in the tribe. So they had individual private property allotments, and then there was extra land on the reservation because of the number of people who were living there. So they passed legislation, the US government did, that said, with agreement of the tribe. And again, precisely how that got negotiated in various places is a little shady sometimes, but they said, then we'll open the land to white homesteading. And what they did many places, including at Spirit Lake, was they had a lottery. So there were, I think, 600 homesteads available at Spirit Lake, and our great grandmother was somebody who got one of those lottery tickets. And so they had the right to then homestead on the reservation.
That was the Dodd Act, wasn't it?
The Dawes Act, yes.
1867 that provided that legislation to restructure the reservations.
Yes, it was. And then they had to have individual legislation for each reservation after that, but that laid the groundwork. That was absolutely critical. Yeah.
Well, I remember reading quite a bit about how following the Dodd Act and allotment, that then there was all forms of trickery and devious means of trying to extract the land that had been allotted to Indians. All sorts of means were used depending on which reservation we're talking about, but some with timber on them, for instance, that was commercially valuable. There were all sorts of devious means that were created to seduce the Indians into deals that were supposed to benefit them, but mostly did not.
Karen?
Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, follow-up question on that. Were there, clearly there were allotted lands, but were there tribal lands that were non-allotted, that were held by the tribe on the reservation itself in the original?
That varies by reservation. So there were,
But on Spirit Lake itself.
There were a few. There were not many. There was land set aside for schools. There was some set aside for churches, and there was some set aside for the tribe, but it wasn't very much. I think other places like Fort Berthold, you find, much more expansive. I mean, it's a much bigger, it's ranch land. It's not farmland, really.
Yeah, I worked with a couple of reservations out west, and the majority of them, they do have tribal, held by the tribe, common lands.
Interesting. Mm-hmm.
Karen, just in anticipation of the upcoming sessions we're going to have, can you compare and contrast the Fort Totten reservation with that of Belcourt?
Well, I don't believe that Turtle Mountain was ever opened to homesteading, and that's because it's so tiny. It's just like what, 2 townships. It's
right.
It's very, very small, so it was not big enough to accommodate even all the people in the Turtle Mountain Bend of Chippewa. And in fact, many Turtle Mountain children went to school at Fort Totten, at the boarding school. And there were some people who were allotted land at Spirit Lake too, and I don't know how that happened. But they were there. So, but I don't know very much specifically about Turtle Mountain.
Thank you. Kat, do you have a question? Catherine Gilgee?
Oh, thank you so much. Well, I really appreciated your presentation, and I do have a question around, have you found other stories or public places where families are looking at the history, reckoning with the history, and, making some steps in amends? Or is there any kind of catalog or place that you might share with us or process?
It's a really good question, and there are none that I know of, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. It just means they're not kind of visibly institutionally. I think, given that kinship systems are intertwined, now that opens a door for discussions in a different way. I gave a talk several years ago at the Mindekirken in Minneapolis, and it is down the street from a tribal center And I don't know if they've done anything, but there were people who came to that talk who had Dakota ancestry and Norwegian ancestry. And, you know, I suggested maybe there should be an open potluck, you know, and a conversation to talk about some of the issues and what happened. So I think families could start trying to have that conversation, and maybe, you know, church supper or something like that would be one way to start it. Yeah.
Other questions?
I have a couple comments.
Yeah.
I'm from Botno originally, right next door to the Turtle Mountain Reservation. And one of the cemeteries by Botno, Manger Cemetery, there is an Indian buried right outside that cemetery.
Right outside the cemetery.
Yep, outside of it. And I don't recall the reason why, if it was just because he was native, I'm not sure. And then I have a question, and that is, was there a lot of teaching and learning between the Scandinavians and the natives? Like, then the natives teach the Scandinavians about medicinal plants to use for medicinal purposes, or, you know, for food?
That's a really good question, and the evidence I've found for that has been similarly through oral histories, and so I think it's a good question. There's evidence of, you know, it's the middle of winter and people are going into labor and going to have a baby, and who do you call and who's nearby who can help. So there are some kinds of sharing like that I've seen. Solomon Red Fox, who died before I came to the reservation, but I was able to interview one of his daughters, you know, told me a story that her father used to tell about. Actually, it was a German man who came early to the reservation and stayed with the Red Fox family and taught some of them to speak English. So it's, you know, it just doesn't always happen the way you think it might happen, you know. And the one thing they remembered about him was that he had wooden shoes, and they thought that was so funny. But he helped them to learn some English, and, you know, so there were these exchanges of, and I would say the most important ones were the exchanges of food. You know, the Dakota people believe strongly in generosity, and you know, especially people barely getting by, you know, when people would open their doors and share a meal, or, you know, give a loaf of freshly baked bread and things like that, that established grounds for exchange in a really important way. So I assume that, you know, information about what berries growing on the prairie can you eat versus which ones are poisonous, you know, those kinds of things, those kinds of exchanges had definitely happened in those early days.
And I have a cousin of my grandma's wrote a family history, and she actually, her parents immigrated from Norway, and they settled in Botno County in the very early, like around 1900 before. She describes how they would dig for something called broadroot. And I tried to research that and find what that was. I even contacted the North Dakota Historical Association, you know, in Bismarck. They had no idea. It's Indian breadroot is what it's called.
I don't think so.
And I can send you the information on that and what plant it is.
Yeah, I'd really like to see
They would
that.
just pick it out of the ground and eat it, she said.
Barbara,
Without
Hendrick
even
Patel,
cooking.
do you have a question
Yeah.
or a comment?
No, I don't. I just like to, I thank Aunt Karen, and the turnip that you were just talking about
Yeah.
is still commonly grown on the prairie. It's a very starchy food that would help you get through a long winter without much food. But it had to be dug at a certain time. It had to be dug in a certain way, so you didn't destroy the whole crop, that there would be some coming next year. So I'm sure those kinds those bits and pieces of information were really, really important in helping the settlers know how to use that prairie turnip. And this is the first case I had come across of European immigrants using that common prairie resource, which is really important.
Additional questions? Arna Estebo from Norway. Do you have a question, Arna?
No, I just sit and think of a story Peter Quiderland told. He come back to Norway to Gilead in the 50s, I think. I grew up as neighbor to him, and he said when he leave, he gave a dog to the Indians. He was very friend with the Indians, and a couple of days after, he was invited for dinner, and they served small piece of meat, and he was so very afraid that it was the dog he ate. Yeah.
Good story. Good. We remember Peter Kvedland. I remember him very well. And
Yeah.
Chuck, I think you might remember Peter too. Very popular guy. Good story. The
Can I ask a question?
Indian reservation, Arna, was about 7 miles north of where Peter lived.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Can I
Okay.
ask a question?
Yes, go ahead. Aaron, hi.
Hi. Hi, everybody. I'm so glad everybody's here. And thank you, Karen. Thank you, Barbara, for last week's. I wasn't here last week, but I watched the recording. This is fascinating stuff. I have a question for both of you. Do either one of you know about the U.S. government's intentions in letting settlers homestead on reservations? That was shocking to me, Karen. I started reading your book and I was shocked by that. And I thought, wow, I mean, the Indians really got ripped off over and over and over again, and we're not in a position to really fight back. They I'm sure knew that they would be overwhelmed by the armies or whatever. But I'm wondering if you know was that the intention of the U.S. government to really just sort of annihilate the Indian culture by letting white people take their land?
Yes. Barbara, do you want to go ahead?
Well, I'll put in some and you can put in some. There's a part of the Dawes Act that I think is really important. And I believe this is actually the wording of Senator Dawes. Karen, maybe you can back me up on this. He says the Dawes Act will teach Indians to be selfish. And he uses that word selfish. It shocked me the first time I saw it because I'm thinking, in kindergarten, that's the first thing you learn is to share and to not be selfish. The Dawes Act wanted to teach Indians to be selfish. Karen brought up, clearly this is a big cultural difference between the two groups that were settled there. But the intention was to have own private property and learn to treasure it as Anglo-Americans or European Americans did. The other thing I think that's important to remember is that there was a couple of parts to this, several parts of this process. And I think one is, your idea is that by eliminating the bison population, which was the major food source, they hamstring the tribal cultures. The other thing is to fill the space then with people who are going to farm and hold that land. They become the other part of this physical barrier around the reservations is to keep, they will prevent any kind of movement off the reservations. So Karen, what do you think?
Yes, that learn to be selfish, learned to treasure private property, and to think as individuals. The US government saw this as the path to citizenship, and land was very much linked to, and private property in particular was linked to citizens as they imagined them. So yeah, the collectivity, and so they really did try to break up tribal government and that collective sense of responsibility. And I guess, to pick up where you left off, one of the things that surprised me in studying the legislation more closely was that they also intended for the reservations to be integrated. And when you think about, this very same moment at, post Civil War, what was happening in the South was completely different. It was about segregation. So the fact that integration was the agenda was a curious twist. And at least part of how they reasoned that is that they thought that for Indian cultures that weren't agriculturally oriented, and some were more than others, right? That it would teach, that having farmers integrated on the land would, allow people to exchange ideas and techniques and all those things. And I think there is some of that, although as I mentioned, it was Dakota women who were the agriculturalists, and they did big gardens and they grew crops annually in the same places. The men were hunters and other things. They weren't planters and cultivators. So that was a huge cultural shift. And there was something else I was going to say about that. It just escaped me, but that was a big shift. And again, private property. Norwegians understood private property in a very different way. They valued private property, and most people who came had been farmers. Maybe they'd been farm workers on somebody else's farm, but maybe that made them value the land all the more. But they understood preservation and passing it on down the generations. So, that is a very different ethic. And accumulation was really important. And as you all know, having 160 acres was barely enough to feed a family in 1910. And by 1930, you were really in trouble if that was all you had. So you find Norwegian farmers, white farmers of all kind, also leasing land from Indians. So even when Indian families kept their land, they would often not cultivate it themselves, but they would rent it to their neighbors, and so their neighbors could become in a sense sharecroppers also, because they would have to share their profits with the landowner. Anyway, it gets more complicated, and I think really important ways.
Karen, are the tribes
Can I ask a
buying
question?
land back today? Are they buying land back from the reservation itself, buying the land back? To what extent is that happening now?
Well, I don't know the extent to that it's happening, but again, I think it is the tribe that has the resources to be able to buy land back. And with the end of the Dawes Act, which is in 1934, there was a privileging of Indian land ownership. So tribal people had right of first refusal, at least in the law books, when land went on the open market. Obviously, there's a huge sea change in who owns land in the 30s because of the drought, and banks end up owning a lot of the land, including on the reservation. That happens again in the 50s. So it kind of keeps going. But I don't know the land ownership statistics today. And as somebody pointed out earlier too, there's the issue of the flooding lake, which has meant a lot of people have just lost their land's underwater. They might have to still pay taxes on it, but it's underwater.
Additional questions. Is there another question?
Is it not true that the reservation system was expensive for the federal government to administer, and they wanted to get out from under that? They came to a conclusion, I believe, that it would be simpler to create kind of a forced assimilation and require Native people to mix in with the rest of the US population, and for the reservations to be phased out.
Is that true?
Is it true that there was quite a bit of cost of running the reservation system?
It's a really good question, and it's a really big question that I can't fully answer. I mean, was their intention to eventually dismantle reservations, which were supposed to be land reserved for Native people into eternity?
Well, I tend to
Yes.
think that there are economic factors that sometimes overwhelm the matters of philosophy and,
Do we have more questions?
social policy.
Any more questions? We're getting towards a,
Chuck,
Chuck,
yeah, I
Paul?
have a question.
who is the question?
Chuck.
Chell, you have,
I have a question, Paul.
go ahead.
Wondering on the reservation initially, assuming that a white person would homestead on the reservation, the money that was paid for the homestead, would that go to the tribe or to the federal government? And secondly, a question about who could homestead. Was there anything that prevented an Indian from homesteading on the reservation? And did the Indian or did the white person have some superior claim to a homestead on the reservation?
Okay, so some good questions. There was legislation passed in 1875, I believe, called the Indian Homestead Act, so that Indians could homestead. Did I see any at Spirit Lake? No. I did see Indians buying land that came on the open market through the Dead Indian Land Act, and also when people wanted to sell. So, but buying is separate. Could they have homesteaded at Spirit Lake if they wanted to? Perhaps, and I actually can't speak to that legally, but there was this legislation passed. Now, theoretically, and this gets back to Michael's question about the economics of it, theoretically, the land people say homesteading was free. Now, when you go back to your family ancestry, you realize that there was nothing free about it. There were fees that you had to pay to file. And at least on the reservations, there was a per acreage fee. And you had to pay with your labor and your sweat, right? You had to develop the land and live on it for 5 years. So there was that form of payment. Theoretically, that money per acre was supposed to go to the tribe. But how much of it actually ended up benefiting the tribe is not really clear to me, because one of the ways I have seen the federal government use funds to that are dedicated to a tribal fund, is to pay for things like new horses that they bought to help with farm work. So they would charge some of those expenses against the funds that were coming in without consulting Dakotas at all. They would just, so what is the real cost? And, certainly Dakota people were entitled to some of that. And how much did they actually get? I think probably a fraction of it, but I can't tell you precisely. But the money was supposed to go to the tribe.
Karen, we've had you for 1 hour and 15 minutes. We'll give one more question from somebody, not a comment, but a question.
How was can I ask a question? How was the coexistence between the Norwegian and Swedish and the white settlers and the Indians after, in the more later up to modern era? How was the,
That's also
society?
a really good question, and I think
Is
it's
it
also
segregated?
complicated.
Is it segregated as before, or is it more? Are they more like intermarriage, or is it white hair and Indians there?
You see more intermarriage, especially after World War II. And, so there are Dakota members who are named Benson, for example, so that definitely happens. Is it a smooth process? No. Is it an important process? Yes. I do tell some stories that I have in the book, but those are, I try to stay before 1930. So and there are only a few documented cases of like a Dakota man marrying a new Norwegian immigrant woman or vice versa. But I will tell you, I'll leave you with one thing to think about. And people on the reservation have said this to me. All those Norwegian bachelor farmers that we hear about. Well, maybe they were involved in informal marriages with Dakota women, and just didn't formalize the relationship. So, that's another whole other project of documentation.
Karen Hansen, terrific. We are in debt to you in ways we can't begin to express. Thank you so much for a perfect afternoon. You did a lot of work in preparation for this. We're so grateful. I want to let you all know that we will hold the Zoom session open for people who want to have comments now after we're through with the session with Karen. So we'll call that an end, but we will hold open in case some of you have some comments on a variety of topics. We'll hold that open. And then one more thing is 2 months from now, we'll have another session, this time on the railroads coming to North Dakota and the impact they had on immigration and on small towns and on Rolette. And then later we'll learn from the Turtle Mountain Reservation how life was there. So thank you very much, but stay on, folks, because we're going to stick around unless you have comments. Okay, Karen, you can stick around
Thank you
too.
so much for coming. It's been a great conversation. And thanks to my cousins for showing up.